Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Michigan here with a new tier list for 2023. And before we start, given that I got a lot of feedback on the last one I made about a year ago, I want to make some clarifications as to exactly why I'm putting vehicles in the tiers that I am, and really what this tier list is all about. So a lot of tier lists you'll see out there are mainly focused around random battles as well as the tank statistics in general. This is not what this tier list is about. This tier list is specifically for clan wars and advances and are perceived through my eyes as to what I call for and what I like to bring in advances. So if you see a tank that may be in the situational and the last resort column that you may think is a very good tank, it still may be a good tank. However, if there's a better option than that vehicle, it probably will not make it into the best choice section. So that's just one thing to keep in mind, and I'll try and address that as we go through. So we're going to start off here with the 113. Now, this right here is a last resort vehicle. And again, using what we just said, why is that? The 113, it's kind of a pretty fast medium. It's almost a little bit of a heavier 430U. However, there's just lots of vehicles that perform better in competitive play. And again, that's what this tier list is all about. It's competitive play. What are competitive teams bringing right now? And the 113 is just not one of those vehicles. Now, it's still a last resort vehicle and not a never bring because it does have decent statistics. This tank actually used to be very meta about 5 years ago, I believe, when it first came out. So it still can perform. It's just not the best vehicle to bring. The 121B is in the same boat there, and a lot of tanks are going to make it into this last resort column. Now, the 121B is a fairly good medium. It's almost a 430U, or a Chinese version of it, boasting good alpha damage, decent speed, and decent armor. However, it's just not a tank that people bring, mainly because it's not that quick. There's a lot of mediums that are quicker, and it doesn't have the best DPM either. Now, the 121 is going to also fall in there, so all three of the Chinese tier 10 heavies and mediums are going to go straight in here. We still have the STB1. This is alphabetically. 60 TP. This one is situational. It used to be a great option before the HE nerf. However, it still does have decent accuracy. It has okay heat pen. It's arguably mediocre at best. But it still does have decent turret armor and that 750 alpha, which is something that's crucial for trading against enemy clans in advances and clan wars. 13105. This is a last resort. It's a decent light tank with a 3-round autoloader, hitting for 390 a shot. However, like I said earlier, there's just better light tanks to bring. This tank doesn't have the same speed as the EBR 105 or the same camo as the Manticore. So normally, tanks and advances really specialize in one item, or they're good at everything, and they're a very, very strong tank, even in random battles. AMX-30B. This is a never-bring vehicle, and it pains me to put it in here because I feel like it should be a last resort, but plenty of things really hurt this vehicle. One, it doesn't have any armor whatsoever, and it's a fairly large vehicle. What it does have is fantastic DPM. I believe it's about 3,700 if you just put even a little bit of, or even base equipment in there. So it's not a bad vehicle. However, in randoms, for competitive play, you really need to have at least a little bit of armor for the most part if you're going to be playing that medium role. And that's because mediums have to be able to brawl, unless you're in a very specific vehicle like the Leopard, which we'll get to later. The 30B does not have the same accuracy as the Leopard, and so therefore it can't fully snipe, which means it may need to get into close combat, and the 30B will just not stand up to enemy vehicles there. One other thing I'd like to mention is that I am not 100% familiar with all the statistics of these vehicles. So I will make mistakes at some point. You're welcome to call out those mistakes. And if I'm brutally wrong, I'm happy to address those. And maybe in the comments I can make a slight adjustment. But there's a lot of tier 10s, and I'm not going to know all of them. 50B. This is a situational vehicle. I would have put this in last resort a couple of months ago. But as I'm experimenting with new calls and trying to take advantage of the speed of 50Bs, I'm starting to use them on occasion. And so I'm going to put it in situational because it does have a 1600 alpha damage in its clip. And it's quickness means that it can get to positions fairly quickly. Now, normally I would use a Object 260, which we'll get to later, and so that's why it's not going in the good option or the best choice. But it's still an alright vehicle, and it can be used on occasion. AMX M454. Now, I'm a little bit torn here between good option and situational. And that's because the AMX has great armor, it has a good alpha damage at 560, and I believe you should only be using the 130mm, and I'll explain that in a second. But its height allows it to shoot down on enemy vehicles, and it's just engine power allows you to push vehicles out of the way and jam up alleyways and all sorts of things. I'm going to put this tank as a good option. And the reason I'm not putting in situational is I do believe it works on quite a few maps. Mainly, you need to have city maps. You know what? We're going to put it in situational. Because on open maps, this tank does struggle. It's very large. It has no side armor. But if you can keep the enemies in front of you, then you are pretty well off. So we're going to stick it in there. And now, why should you use the 130mm? Well, this tank's strength is in its armor and its alpha, if you're using that 130. If you're using the 120mm, you're hitting for 400 damage. And there's another vehicle coming up, the S-Conqueror, somewhere down there, that also hits for 400, and it doesn't have the same hull armor as the AMX. Now, it does have better gun depression, 10 degrees, as opposed to the AMX's 8. However, if you're going to have a tank that hits for 400mm or 400 alpha, there's plenty of better tanks to bring, and again, that's what this is all about. Is there a better option? And there's not many better options as a pseudo fast heavy, super heavy than the AMX M4 when it's using the 130mm. So enough about that. We're going to move into the Badger. Another situational vehicle. Now this tank has great DPM. I believe one of the best in the game. It might be the second behind the Sturv. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong. But it has great rate of fire, good alpha. I believe it also hits for, maybe it hits for 520 or 540 or 560. It's one of those three. But it has to keep enemies in front of it. It's not that quick, so it can't maneuver, and that's another big factor of a lot of these vehicles that we've seen so far, is speed. So you need most of these things. You need good firepower, good armor, and good speed to really start making it up into that good option and best choice, and we'll see plenty of those tanks later. Batchat 15558, never bring. We rarely bring artillery in today's meta, and if we do, it's normally the 261 or the GC. There really isn't a place in the meta right now for a tank that has a 3-round autoloader. As an artillery, it has low pen and low damage and low stun potential. So while it can help finish off one-shots, oftentimes those one-shots in competitive play are going to be hiding behind rocks and whatever to make sure they don't get shot. So if the Batchat's unable to finish the one-shots, then it really doesn't make it worth bringing at all. Batchat 25T. This is a last resort vehicle. We're still kind of messing around with it, but for the most part, I don't call for this vehicle anymore, mainly because it takes a long time to unload those shells, and it doesn't have any armor and any hit points. So it does have a large clip potential. I believe it is somewhere between 17 and 2,000. I can't do the math in my head right now. It's got one of the highest, but it doesn't have any armor, and it's a fairly large medium as well. So it just doesn't really have a good place in today's meta. Cent AX. We're going to put this in last resort as well. Good DPM, decent speed, and after the buff, it's actually quite better. But there are better vehicles to bring than that. So, good tank, but not for today's meta. Chieftain, our first best choice. Now, you may argue that after the Chieftain nerf, that it is no longer, that the stats are worse than they were before. However, it didn't really drop below many other tanks. And there is the KPZ, which will come up here. However, the KPZ doesn't have the same gun depression, and it doesn't hit for the same amount. So it has better alpha, it has better DPM, doesn't have the same alpha, and yes, it's 30 less, which isn't a huge factor, but it is important when you're trading 1-for-1, and it's still reasonably quick. So on most maps where you don't need to just bomb it somewhere, the Chieftain works great. Conqueror gun carriage. Situational, we'll put it in last resort here. Mainly because artillery has pretty much fallen all the way out of the meta, and with a lot of the camping maps removed, like El Haluf, that this tank doesn't really have a place. Most teams are not camping on maps that really require a GC to shoot behind large buildings or rocks, so therefore, we're going to put this tank in last resort. E100. Situational. It is a quicker heavy than the Maus, but it does have a very flat turret, which means it's penned quite easily. It also has 2 nice choices of guns. Now, oftentimes I'll tell members, just take whatever gun you feel more comfortable with, either that be the 128 that hits for 520 after the buff, a few years ago, or the 750. Now, in Super Heavies, I always prefer the larger caliber gun, mainly because you're going to be trading. If you're bringing Super Heavies, the enemy's probably bringing Super Heavies as well, and you're not in a position to out-DPM your opponent. If the enemies are pushing into you all the time, then you're going to want the faster rate of fire, higher DPM gun, because you can spread your damage around and you can finish off those one-shots. Nothing's worse than being in a 750 alpha tank, and then you have to shoot a tank with 29 hit points. So if you have a gun that's has lower alpha damage, you'll reload quicker and you'll be able to better maximize your DPM. E50M. This is a last resort vehicle, and this is going to be quite a large column. I may have to actually minimize this a little bit, but just want to keep it large so you can all see it. Just go to 100% for now. So, good armor, okay gun, it's a great rammer. But a lot of times we're not bringing tanks and advances to ram people with. We need tanks for a lot of situations. And the E50M just isn't the best choice. EBR, best choice. Fastest tank in the game. Perfect scout. Its wheels pull off some ridiculous miracles when you have, a Jagdpanzer E100 hit it. Somehow it doesn't do any damage. So it does block a decent amount. Okay gun. It has pretty bad rate of fire, but it gets the job done. It's not there to out-DPM vehicles, but it's great for driving in, coming around somebody, and finishing them off. So, decent tank there. It can rotate super quickly, and it can get itself out of bad situations, unlike the 13105 that we spoke about earlier. Foch 155. This is a never-bring vehicle for me, and that's mainly because of its cousin here, the Foch, or the Foch B, in which we're going to put in situational. So, we're going to do both of these at the same time. Now, the Foch 155 has 3, I believe, 700 or 650. I don't remember what it is now, but it's between 650 and 750 damage shots with a 5-second inner clip. The Foch B has 400 alpha damage shots with a 2-second inner clip. So, the Foch 155 unloads with 10 seconds. And so does the Foch B. However, what the Foch B has is it can spread out its damage better. So the Foch B is just a little bit better. We only call for it on one map currently, which is Cliff, where we'll use it to unload on enemy tanks trying to drive up the donut. So it is situational. I believe the Foch B is better. And if you disagree with me, let me know if you really like the Foch 155. But again, this is my personal list, so that is why I'm placing these where they are. FV215B. Never bring. If there was a column below never bring, I'd put it there. No side armor. It can't side scrape. It's just a super conqueror that doesn't have any armor and no gun depression and is rear turreted for some reason. It's a terrible vehicle. They removed it for a reason. 4005. The you-know-what barn. The problem with these vehicles that have very high alpha and very low pen is that they're unreliable. And what you really need when you're calling battles is reliability. You can't rely on a 4005 to hit a tank for 1800 and then have it not hit for 1800 and that screw your call up. So because of its inconsistency, you cannot bring it. Coupled with the fact that it doesn't have any armor whatsoever. So, and it's huge. So enemy tanks can just HE it to death, and it doesn't have any camo either, especially when it fires. So that tank is a big no-go. Grill 15. I've been messing around with this vehicle a little bit on some calls. However, I'm still going to put it in last resort. Mainly because, again, it doesn't have any armor, and it hits for 750 as a sniping TD. What we want most of the time for sniping tank destroyers is DPM, because their goal is to cover forces that are in front of them, maybe on a ridgeline. So what you're hoping to do with a covering TD is to use your DPM and, take out the enemy tanks that are pushing over onto your forces so you can keep that edge alive. If you're looking to snipe with a TD, this is an okay option, but a lot of the times we may need that TD or whatever tank is sniping to then get into the fight later on. And unfortunately, because of the grill's lack of armor and hit points and DPM, it can't play that later game stage where it may need to go in there and brawl an opponent. So therefore, we'll often put medium tanks over there, and other sniping vehicles such as a Sturv, which can at least take a couple of hits. GW E100, never bring. It is not an artillery that's used. It has good alpha damage, good stun potential, but artillery is not in the meta today. IS-7, I'm going to put this in best choice. I really like the IS-7. It combines speed with decent alpha and great armor. It's a great all-arounder. It does struggle with its 6 degrees of gun depression to work ridgelines at all, but most of the time we're just bombing this tank into a position, especially on the fast-paced maps like Himmelsdorf or Fish Bay, where we really just need to get the fastest tank with the most armor and the best gun into a position as early as possible, and it doesn't need gun depression. The i7 excels at ramming vehicles, especially when you can get it up to its top speed of almost 70 kilometers an hour. Coupled with its weight, it really will push enemy tanks out of the way, especially when you hit them from the side. I rammed for 800 with this going downhill, so definitely a one of the best option vehicles. JPE100, this is a never bring vehicle. It's incredibly slow, and in advances, everybody's shooting heat. So there is really no reason to bring this vehicle. Can't get into position, it can't block shots, and yes, while it can hit for 1,050, oftentimes when you're getting ready to make that shot, you're going to lose that amount of hit points on top of it. K91. This is a last resort vehicle. Actually, we're probably going to put it into never bring. Great DPM, low alpha, however, and it's just not the best vehicle. It's rear turreted as a medium, which means it has to be on flat ground or on a downslope facing towards the enemy. So with that, it makes it fairly inflexible. It's quite frustrating to use unless you can keep the enemies in front of you. No armor, and it's just not a great vehicle. Kranvagn. This is a last resort vehicle, mainly because of its nerf. This used to be a great tank, but with its dispersion nerfs and its gun handling and reload, all of that, it's not the best vehicle. It does still have 12 degrees of gun depression and a 3-round autoloader with decent DPM. It's just not the best vehicle, and it's easily overshadowed by the Chieftain and the KPZ, which unfortunately is not on this list, as well as the Concept 5. However, we will get to those later. I'll have to just kind of tell you where I would put them. Alright, moving on to the Leopard 1. This is a good option vehicle. We do bring it on a decent amount of maps. It is sort of situational, but it's a great sniper, and we do use it on more maps than not. So anywhere where we need a sniper, a Leopard works, and a Sturv most of the time works. It has great damage per minute, it's very quick, and it has great accuracy. It can really make its shots count. Again, going back to consistency. The Leopard will be consistent as long as it's in the hands of a consistent player as well. So that's another thing to take into account here. M48A5 Patton. This is a never bring vehicle. Reasonably quick, however, it has a good gun and great view range actually for medium. However, it has a giant tumor on the top of it, which means it can't really utilize its gun depression. Again, it's just not the best vehicle to bring, overshadowed by a lot of the Russian mediums that we're going to speak about earlier. M60. Again, a never bring vehicle for the same reasons as the Patton. Giant tumor on the top, it's got good speed, it's got okay armor, but it's just not the best vehicle. Manticore. This is a situational vehicle, and we've brought it on occasion. We're still experimenting with it. It does struggle with its damage per minute, though, and it also can't get out of situations very quickly. So what it relies on is being stealthy and ensuring that it spots enemy vehicles while also not being spotted itself. If this tank gets spotted, it sort of can get away, but it's not reliable like an EBR is. So that is something to take into account. We are experimenting with it, so I will make it a situational vehicle. We're going to put the Maus as a situational vehicle as well, and we've actually started to use it on some odd maps like Live Oaks, where we've actually brought it into the middle, which has been quite interesting, into the swamp. Now this vehicle struggles with its speed, but it does have the most hit points in the game, and with the turbo and the field mods and all that, and you can get a mobility spot, and you can actually make this vehicle go fairly quickly. So it does start to work. It also has a nice gun with 490 alpha and decent DPM. Unlike the E100, It doesn't need to angle its turret as much. It still does, because it does have a curved frontal turret rather than a flat one, so it does make it a little bit more survivable. Moving on quickly, Object 140. We're going to put this in the best choice column for mediums. This tank is the best of speed, armor, and mobility that you can get as a medium. It's more flexible than a 907 because it has better gun depression, and it's just a great all-around tank to bring. 260. This is a best choice vehicle as well. This tank is one of the fastest heavies there is, and it has low damage per shot at 440, but it has great DPM and okay armor. The armor isn't great, but it is sloped back. It does have a gigantic lower plate, but again, if it's able to get in position early, get hull down, it is a great choice to have. We're going to put the Object 261 in situational. Arguably the best artillery right now, if you're going to bring in artillery. We do use this on a few maps. It has great rate of fire, good accuracy. It does struggle a little bit with ammunition. I think it only carries 30. And it has okay speed, so oftentimes we can use this artillery to lock down a position. However, we're usually never going to bring more than one. Object 268. Now, this one I'm going to put in last resort. I would love to put it in best choice because this is my favorite vehicle, but we're going to put it in last resort. And let's talk about what's good about the 268. This tank is one of the most accurate Russian tanks there is. I believe I have mine down to 0.27 accuracy. And again, this is a Russian vehicle with 750 alpha. It's got great speed, and it has okay armor. It's built on a T10 chassis. It's not going to block a lot, but it will block more than you would expect. However, it does suffer from a low shell speed. It does have 300 and, I believe, 80 or 390 millimeters, 395, that's the number I'm looking for, millimeters of heat pen, so it will go through almost every tank, second only to the Jagdpanzer E100 in terms of penetration. So with its speed, you can get it up to positions early, and then use its fantastic DPM of almost 3,600 to lock down any opponents who are trying to poke. With the 395 heat pen, you can go through the turrets a lot of vehicles, even those that are going hull down. 268 version 4. This is a good option vehicle. It was nerfed. However, it's great for rushing down alleyways and just ramming enemy tanks out of the way. It has good armor, and the lower plate isn't great, but it does have a false lower plate, so you actually have to shoot the lower plate and a weak point on the top. And it also has no gun depression, but that's not why you're bringing the vehicle. You're bringing it to get into the face of enemy tanks, clear the way so that whatever heavies you have coming behind it can circle in and get behind those tanks. This is a great face-hugging tank for when it's appropriate, and I really like calling for it. Though it's a little more than situational, but it's not the best choice. Object 277. This is a good option vehicle. It's not the best, but it is faster than an IS-7. It doesn't have the same armor, and it does have heat instead of APCR. I prefer APCR on heavies. Most of the time, you can make the argument that, well, APCR loses penetration over distance, but that's not what heavies are about. Heavies are there for those close-range engagements. And the 277, with its heat rounds, it does get some weird bounces when you're shooting into the tracks. I prefer APCR just because I know what I'm getting, and I'm not rolling the dice as much. And that's coming from somebody who is not the best player. Object 430U. This is a last resort vehicle. This used to be meta. I believe it was nerfed a little bit. It's very similar to the 121 and the 121B there, given that it has 440 alpha, decent armor, and a decent gun. But again, it's just not as fast as the Object 140. Object 279E. This is a best choice vehicle. Again, a nerfed vehicle where its speed was nerfed, I believe, and its penetration was nerfed. However, its armor remains unchanged, and it's still a very, very difficult for enemy tanks to deal with. Its rate of fire is fantastic. Its armor is just, uncomparable to any of the other vehicles here, at least heavies. And in the hands of a good player, this can be an incredibly dangerous vehicle. Object 705A. This is a never bring vehicle, and it pains me because the 705A has so much potential. It's a side-scraping king. It has fantastic armor. It's not that slow either. It's actually reasonably quick. But what kills it is its penetration and its accuracy. You will poke out around a corner, or you'll side-scrape on a corner, and you will either just miss, or the shot will go nowhere where you want it to. And it's incredibly frustrating because you're going to bounce a lot of the return fire, but you're just going to struggle to do any damage to the enemy vehicles. If it had 750 alpha instead of the 650, you may be able to justify it a little more, but it has a very standard lower plate, so it really needs to side scrape, and therefore this is a never bring vehicle. Alright, Object 140. Now, as I mentioned before, it's a little different than the 140, and I'd love to put it in good option, but I'm actually going to put it in best choice. Now, initially when I recorded this, I had to actually go back and re-record it. I was speaking about why it was a good option, and it occurred to me that we actually bring the 907 just as much, if not a little more, than the 140. In close quarters engagements, the 907 is one of the best mediums you can bring, if not the best. Its boat-shaped hull, its armor, its DPM is fairly unmatched, at least in close quarters. This tank will suffer at longer ranges on maps like Westfield when you're dueling the enemy mediums, because you don't have the gun oppression that the 140 has. The 140 has 7 degrees as opposed to the 907's 5, and that may only seem like it's only a 2-degree difference, but it's quite massive even when you're working very subtle ridge lines, and the 907 can be very frustrating to handle. However, in brawls, the 907 is better than the 140, so that's just something to keep in mind there. But the 907, regardless, is a best choice medium. Progetto M40 Mod 65. Never bring this tank. It was nerfed. We don't usually use auto reloaders. They're a little more of a solo vehicle. And the reasoning for that is, a lot of players will tend to just dump clip, and that usually doesn't work. And if you're going to be timing your reload, it's very difficult to use that mechanic in a team setting because it's a very individual vehicle. So for that reason, it is a never bring. It was nerfed, and all of its statistics kind of went down for whatever reason. It wasn't a meta tank before. It definitely isn't now. Panzer 7. Worst version of the VK7501K that we will see earlier. This tank hits for 560 alpha damage, and it is a great side scraper. However, if you're looking where my mouse is, this tank has what we call the Triangle of Doom, which when you side scrape, it is a massive weak point. And while the VKK also has this weak point, it is much smaller. The Panzer 7 cannot justify side scraping on corners against 750 alpha tanks if it does not have 750 alpha itself, and it most certainly doesn't. So this tank, not very good. Again, there's a much better option. Rheinmetall Panzerwagen. This is it could be a last resort, but I'm still going to put it in never bring. It just got a DPM buff. However, in competitive play, and again, I have to keep reiterating that, the goal for light tanks is not to do damage. It's to get vision, help the caller understand what the enemy vehicles or where they're going and what the enemy caller's plan is, not to go in there and start ripping apart tanks. That's great, but what we really need is for tanks who can get in, get out safely. The Panzerwagen is not able to do that. It's fairly large, and it doesn't have any armor. So, not a good tank, don't bring it. Sheridan, same idea. We basically take all of what the Rheinmetall Panzerwagen was, and then combine it with a 4005 and make it inconsistent. So not only can you not get in and out of situations, you can't hide, but you also can't really do damage because you're using a giant cannon on there, and I think actually you may have the option for 105, but if you're going to bring a Sheridan, you might as well just bring the derp cannon, the 155. It's not a vehicle for competitive play. It's a great random tank, but again, it's inconsistent. ST2, last resort vehicle. It's kind of like an IS-4 with a double-barreled gun, 440 alpha in each, but again, it can be inconsistent, and it's not conducive to team play, at least competitive team play. The double barrel mechanic, while it can work initially, you can then damage your team's chances when your guns are blocked and you're not able to reload. It's also fairly slow, can't get into position that quick, and it doesn't have the greatest gun depression. However, if you're in a pinch and you need a heavy, this one will work. STB-1, good option. This tank, great DPM. It has the hydropneumatic suspension, so it gets 14 degrees of gun depression. It hits for 360, which is lower than some of the mediums, like the Leopard that hit for 420, but higher than, so let's say, the Object 140, the 907, that hit for 320. That combined with pretty good turret armor, it does have a weak point on the top, though it's fairly hard to hit, especially if you're rocking, means that this is a great option and a tank that I'm really going to start looking at a little more in advances. Sturv. This is a good option tank as well, along with the Leopard. This tank, it does not have a turret like the Leopard does, but it has camo that's fantastic, and from the front, it can take a reasonable amount of hits as long as you're facing the enemy vehicles head on. So, the only struggle with this tank is it has a low damage per shot. I believe it's 390, but it can pump out that DPM quite nicely. And if vehicles are looking at the side of it, then, you're going to get penned, because I think it's only a 30mm plate, and pretty much everything is going to overmatch it. Super Conqueror. This tank right here is a situational vehicle. And the reasoning for that mainly is just the speed. We're going to just move it down there. But it does work in quite a few scenarios, mainly because of its... You know what? We're going to put it in a good option. This tank, it's slower than the Chieftain, though it's not that much slower after the nerf, and it has better DPM. It also has the same amount of gun depression. So if you can keep enemies in front of you, you can use that crazy damage per minute, I believe it's almost 3,600 when you're using equipment, to just shred enemy vehicles. It's also not going to take any damage from heat rounds really on the front, unless they overmatch the roof, because of those nice shields that it has on the front of its turret. So this is a great vehicle. Again, it is a little slow, and it doesn't have very good hull armor, and it's fairly large, but with that great DPM and that very accurate gun, you can usually use it to cover heavy vehicles moving in if you're not on the front line yourself. T100LT, this is a last resort vehicle, and it's pretty good. It combines sort of the best things of the Manticore with the Rheinmetall Panzerwagen, the EBR with the Panzerwagen. It's pretty quick. It has decent armor and an okay gun. Again, there just isn't a huge spot for it. The vast majority of teams will only use EBRs purely for their speed. And the T100, it can bounce, but it's still a light tank, and with everybody firing gold, it usually isn't going to cut it. T110E3. This is a good option vehicle, and I know it's a super heavy, but it can be used in a lot of ways. The 750 Alpha with the fantastic armor, and I continue to say fantastic for this vehicle, and it's not that slow either. So you can pretty much bring this anywhere. It may trundle into position, but once it gets there, as long as it's hull down, it is going to be a force to be reckoned with. And a lot of times on almost every map, if possible, or if I can make it work, I like to bring a 750 Alpha tank. And that's because there is a term that we call one-shots. And the name is fairly self-explanatory. If you're a one-shot, get to the back, keep your tank alive, and then just take shots as you can safely. However, one-shot only applies to the vehicles that have health lower than the highest alpha damage tank on the enemy team. So if the enemy team only has, let's say, 277s, then a one-shot is anybody who has 490 hit points or less. If there's an E3 covering that area, that means that a one-shot means anybody who has less than 750 alpha. And what that does is that forces enemy tanks to play a little more conservatively, because they're afraid of getting shot by an E3 who's somewhere in the back that they can't see. It means they have less room to maneuver with their hit points, and anybody who does poke and take a hit from that E3 needs to be on more than 750 health, or they're going to risk losing that vehicle. So it's a nice fear tactic to have an E3. T110E4, this is a never bring vehicle, and it's like the E3, but with less armor and a fully traversable turret. The turret is not what is important when you're trying to cover alleyways or support tanks from the rear. What you really need is that armor and just the alpha. Now, the E4 cannot play up front either because of its lack of armor and its weak point. Now, you can see both tanks have a little cupola on the top. While the E4's is incredibly weak, the E3's is very strong, and it can be penned by, I believe, 360 millimeters of heat. We'll be able to go through it most of the time, but it's not that reliable, especially at range. So keep that in mind. E4, turret not needed at the sacrifice of armor. T110E5, this is a last resort vehicle. Big tumor on top, great gun, good speed, but it is overshadowed by the Chieftain and the Eskong, so therefore it's not the best vehicle. Now, we are missing vehicles down here, which I'm sure you're noticing, and I'm going to address those afterward, so don't worry about that. T57 Heavy. This is a situational vehicle, and I'm trying to experiment with it. It doesn't have the greatest statistics, but what it does have is a gun that's very similar to the 50B, which we put in situational. But it unloads those shells almost, I believe, 30% quicker, something like that. The about 20% quicker. The 50B, it's 2.5 seconds. The T57 Heavy is 2 seconds. So this tank can dump out 1600 Alpha in 6 seconds. It also has a better reload than the 50B, but it does lose some of the speed and also gets a little more armor. So we're trying to experiment with it. It's great, 6 seconds, 1600 damage. That's a huge hit to the enemy team right there, as long as it can stay safe, reload, and get another clip out. If it can get 2 clips out, it's done its hit points, and everything else from there is all profit. T62A. This is a last resort vehicle. It's basically a worse version of the 140. It doesn't have as good statistics. It's just not an overall great vehicle. Don't want to go too far into it. I don't even think it's played with randoms. It's actually been removed out of the tech tree now, and you can just pick it up for 6 million gold. So have fun with it, but not in advances. T92. This is a never bring vehicle as well, along with the other artillery. Biggest gun in the game, 280 millimeter gun. Bad accuracy. If it hits, it's going to do a lot of damage. The gun arc, or the gun traverse to the left and right, isn't great. And it's just not, it's inconsistent. Like the 215B183, which actually we'll get to later. I have to add those in. And the Death Star. So don't bring that tank. T95E6. This is a Clan Wars reward tank, and we're going to put it in last resort. Because it has great DPM, fantastic DPM, okay turret, but what it does have is a giant weak point on the top. So it's just not that great. Arguably, it should go down here. It should probably go down here with Never Bring, but its DPM is good enough that I think you can squeeze it in last resort if you have to. I'd rather have a T95E6 than a Patton or an M60. I think it's about as quick as an M60. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong there. TVP 5051. This is a situational vehicle. It has the quickest unload speed out of any of the Tier 10 vehicle autoloaders. Tier 10 autoloaders. It has a 1.5 second inner clip with 4 shells in the magazine. So in 4.5 seconds, you can deal 1,280 damage, 320 for each. So while it has that great unload speed, it's very fast, it has no armor, and it has no hit points. Only 1,800 hit points at Tier 10 is really pushing it. It also, against high caliber guns, it's going to get hit with HE. So what this tank really needs to do is dump and run. So it's a tough vehicle. It is situational. We do use it at times. And when you can get those TVPs rolling, with that 20-second reload and that speed, you can really cause havoc as long as they're not contested. Type 5 Heavy, Never Bring. This tank is a Credit and XP Pinata. It has good armor, but against heat rounds, especially at Tier 10, and coordinated heat fire, it's going to melt. And it's a huge vehicle. It can't really hide. The gun's okay, but it's way too slow for any of this. And it's just, again, the mouse and the E100 are far better. UDES 1516. This is a vehicle that I believe deserves some more love, but until I understand it and really work on it, I'm going to have to put it in last resort. It has great gun depression, and it's a fairly accurate gun. It has decent armor, and it's fairly quick. And while it does have gun depression, it is a rear-mounted vehicle, and I believe it has that hydropneumatic suspension like the Sturv 103B. But until I really understand it, and I see other teams calling for it, we can justify bringing it, it has to go in the last resort column. VK7201K. This is a great option vehicle. This tank, it's like a Panzer 7 down there, but without a lot of the downsides. It still has a little weak point, but it's much smaller. The whole top bar isn't a weak point. It's just a small triangle underneath there, right where the tip of that finger is on the mouse, if you can see that. So that's the only weak point. It also has 750 alpha with okay heat pen. It's not great, but it's 750 instead of 560, and therefore you can justify poking, as most of the vehicles you face will not have anything higher than that unless there's a sneaky JP E100 hanging around that corner. WZ111 5A. This is a situational vehicle. No, it's a last resort vehicle. It has 7 degrees of gun depression, and it's basically a 277, but it's a little slower, and it wants to be something, but it really isn't. It wants to be a fast heavy, but it's not quick enough. It wants to be a gun depression heavy, but it doesn't quite have enough gun depression. And it hits for 490. You know, if it hit for maybe 580 or something, or even with worse DPM, maybe it would go in situational. But it isn't quite there. It doesn't have the 10 degrees of gun depression that the Chieftain has. It doesn't have the top speed that the 277 has, or the armor that the IS-7 has. It doesn't have the clip potential that the T57 has got, or anything. It's so close, but it's not quite there. WZ-111 13 GFT. Don't bring this tank. There's no need to bring it. The armor is not great. I mean, it's thick, but it's kind of flat, and it's just sort of an ISU 152 at tier 10. I don't like it. WZ-132-1. This tank, I really wish it was better, but it has to go and never bring. It's a Chinese light tank that is sort of similar like the 111-5A, and that's the case with a lot of these vehicles. It has a decent gun. I believe it hits for 390. It has great turret armor. It doesn't have any gun depression, and it's fairly quick. But it doesn't have that factor in it that's just so much better. There's no statistic about the WZ-132-1 that makes it better than any of the vehicles even above the last resort. It's just a T100 that's just a touch worse. And it looks cool with the cage around it, but it's just not that great. So I'm going to get the other vehicles added in here, and then we're going to jump right back. Alright, well, I had a list of 5 vehicles, and I looked, and there was way more than 5 that I missed. So I tried to do the one with the names, but clearly I didn't notice that a bunch were missing. So, Beijing Opera. Again, it's a 113, and actually for the other ones, I'm not even going to put them in. I didn't even load them. I thought I'd delete this one. This one is a last resort vehicle. It's a 113, just reskinned. Now, this is I believe the 116 F3, or sorry, the 114 SP2. Doesn't matter, whatever it is, never bring it. We're going to just get rid of both of those. Where is the other one? Here it is. 116 F3 and the 114 SP2. Both of these vehicles are a little slow. One has a 3-run autoloader. The other one's a semi-sniper with 650 alpha. Nowhere needed for competitive play. Ignore them. They're not very good, even as a Clan Wars reward tank. BC-75, situational. Now, we've been experimenting using this up on mines. The rocket boosters allow it to sort of keep up with 277s, but what it does bring up there is a little bit more armor and a 650 alpha damage gun. The rocket boosters allow you to also ram mediums for tremendous results if you get that opportunity. So this is a great vehicle. VZ-55. This is a good option tank. And it's been removed. It's since been nerfed. However, it still has the ability to dump 2 shells, albeit within 2.5 seconds now. But that 980 alpha between the 2 shells is incredibly good for a fast heavy. Minotauro. This is a situational vehicle. Now we use it somewhat, not as much as we used to, but it can really hold its own. And when it's firing, I believe it has over 5,000 damage per minute. So it's not a vehicle to be messed with. It has 10 degrees of gun depression. It has amazing armor. And while its accuracy isn't good, most of the time it is firing close range. So decent vehicle, great statistics, but situational in competitive play. Hori 3. This is a last resort vehicle. And, I've heard some people saying that it's pretty good, but I'm yet to figure out exactly what to do with it. It's pretty quick. It's got okay armor. It's not amazing. It hits for 600, and it's got good accuracy. It's kind of like a version 4 that doesn't want to be all the way at the front. So to me, it has a little bit of an identity crisis as to what its purpose is, but not a horrible vehicle. Let's zoom this out. All right, Concept 5. Don't bring it. It's terrible. I'm sure everybody here is familiar with the Concept 5. If you're not, it's the first British wheeled medium that has none of the positives of the EBR. It has good accuracy. The EBR does too. It's not very fast like the EBR. It's much bigger, and its camo is terrible. So there's really no reason to bring it. CS63. This is a good option tank. It's incredibly quick, and it's great DPM. Doesn't have great gun depression, but what the CS does is get to positions early, battles it, and then is able to continue on and reposition or support whatever else is pushing up the hill after him. So used on mines, used on Westfield, it's used in quite a few areas. Even on Himmelsdorf, we use it to scout the hill out because you don't want to bring a light up there. Great vehicle, great option. M5Y. This is a last resort vehicle, and the only reason I'm not putting it in never bring is because of the gun, which has good DPM. You use the stock gun on it, not the top gun with the 360 Alpha. The problem is if you're not facing directly at enemies like the Sturv 103B, the enemies will pen your turret big time. And because of the length of the turret, if you're using your gun depression and you look down too far, they can pen the back of your turret, which is now sticking straight up in the air. So it's very infuriating to use. So something to keep in mind. Object 268 version 5. Last resort vehicle. It's got good alpha, 750. It's pretty quick. I'd say it's about as fast as maybe an IS-4 or an ST2, but it doesn't have any armor. It's sort of built on a 277 chassis, I think. But it just doesn't have any of the armor of the 277. Now, it would be fine if it didn't have the hull armor, but it doesn't have the turret armor either, which means when you're going around to trade, you're going to struggle. It's pretty much the same gun as the Object 268. It is the same gun as the Object 268, mounted on a lighter 277 chassis with less armor. So, while it's a workable vehicle, especially with I think a fully traversable turret, I may be wrong, there's no real need for that in competitive play, given that there's far better TDs. The Lion. Now, this is a situational vehicle. It used to be a good option, but it's kind of fallen to situational a little bit. Now, this is a auto-reloading semi-sniper that has 4 rounds in its quote-unquote magazine. Now, it's sort of a pseudo-Leopard, so it has less DPM overall than the Leopard, but the 4 rounds with the 4 seconds inner clip sort of make it like a Caro 45T, which I'm now realizing I forgot to add. So I'll cut this video and I'll add it in at the end. So what it does allow it to do, especially with its slightly better armor, is to out-duel enemy vehicles who are on 1600 health or less. It hits for 400, and with that 4-second inner clip, within 12 seconds, you can kill a vehicle that has 1200 health. Unlike the Leopard, it won't get HE'd all the time, but it doesn't have the same accuracy as a Leopard or the same speed. So it's a bit of a trade-off. Still a great vehicle, but it is more situational than the Leopard, which has sort of taken a front seat in today's meta. The T-22 Medium. We're going to put this as a last resort vehicle. It's similar to a 907, and it's a very strong medium. However, because we don't specifically call for a T-22 medium, it can't be situational. Remember, situational vehicles are vehicles that we physically call for. Not, oh, you don't have a 907, so you're going to bring a T-22 medium. That's, again, last resort. We don't have a 907, so we're going to bring a T-22. Right? We don't have an S-Conk, so we'll bring an E5. That's what last resort is. It is a good tank. It has good statistics, but it's not a 907. So, there we go. T-22 medium. KPZ-07P in parentheses E. This is a good option vehicle. To me, this is still not a Chieftain. It doesn't have the same gun depression, and it's a lot bigger than the Chieftain. It's a lot taller. And while the armor does seem to be better, especially with that bulldozer at the top, it can't always play the same position as a Chieftain, or at least as easily, because of the 2 degrees less of gun depression. Remember, the VZ55 also has 8 degrees of gun depression as well, and a strong turret. What the KPZ does have, that the Chieftain doesn't have, is better DPM and better gun handling. This tank is a great sniper, and therefore what we do oftentimes is we'll mix Chieftains with KPZs. However, normally I prefer Chieftains over KPZs, therefore the Chieftain is the best choice and a KPZ is a good option. FE215B 183, never bring. If you remember, where was the 4005? There it is, right there, 4005 Stage 2. Same idea, it's inconsistent. However, the 215B actually has better armor, so it's not going to get pounded as much, and it's also it's rear turreted, so it can sort of size great, but don't bring it. It's not a good tank. Rhinoceronte, don't bring it. Still not a great vehicle. Hasn't really received any major buffs that would make it usable. It's an auto reloader Italian tank with 3 rounds, and it has 490 alpha. So it's a okay vehicle. I don't even think it's that great in randoms. I haven't played it, but from what I've heard, it's not that great. And there's just, again, no place in it. We're never asking people, if we don't have a Chieftain, and we don't have a Super Conqueror, and we don't have an AMX M4 or Minotauro, and we don't have any of the other heavies in Last Resort, we've got bigger problems. So Minotauro, we don't bring it. IS-4, Last Resort. It's sort of like an ST2 with a single gun. It's very well armored, but it's very slow, so it can't really maneuver, and oftentimes very slow vehicles who are holding down alleyways are things like the E3. Alright, last but not least, the Carro de Combatimiento 45T. I hope I pronounced that right. We're going to put this in Last Resort. Now, it's an auto-reloading Italian tank. It's very similar to the Lion, but it's just not as good as the Lion. It's a little bit slower, and it doesn't have great armor. It has okay armor, but it's just not as good. Its statistics are slightly worse, and therefore we're going to put it in Last Resort. If we don't have a Lion, we'll probably take a Leopard or even a medium. So the Carro 45T is a Last Resort vehicle. So I really hope I didn't forget anything. If I did, please let me know, and I'll try and even make a follow-up video with the ones I missed if there's enough. I don't think I missed any, but if I did, let me know. Please remember that this tier list is based off of competitive gameplay, advances, and clan wars, and is my personal opinion. Best choice is the tank I would like to have the most. Good option is tanks that are great on most maps. Situational are tanks that we'll use in certain scenarios. Last Resort is sort of the backups for everything in the top 3. And never bring is the vehicles that we try and avoid at all costs. So I really hope you enjoyed this. It's been a long video. I hope this is a good follow-up to my previous tier list. And if you liked the video, let me know if you disagree with some of where these vehicles are put. Also, let me know. I'm happy to discuss with you. I answer all the comments, so I can go back and forth as much as you'd like. And again, thank you for watching, and I will catch you next year for the next tier maker. See ya.